In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to make the traditional Dorset Crosswheel button. You will need a ring. Ensure that it is a closed ring. You don't want any gaps, so your traditional split ring jewelry rings are not any good. You'll also need a long length of thread. How long will of course depend on the size of your ring. And you will need a tapestry needle with your thread threaded onto the tapestry needle. The first thing that you need to do is you need to work what is called in the Dorset tradition casting, which is covering the ring with blanket stitches. If you hold your thread behind the ring, the thread that is attached to the needle, bring the needle through the front of the ring to the back, hooking that thread behind it, and then draw through. You still need to hold on to that tail initially, so it gives you a little bit of a knot. Then you can continue to work your blanket stitches in exactly the same way, straight up through and tighten. But what you're actually doing is you're covering the tail at the back of the button. You don't need to cover the tail all of the way around. Once you've done a few stitches and you know that that is secure, you can go ahead and trim that tail off so it's not in the way. And then you just continue to cover the ring in blanket stitches. Now, I'm sure that this will be quite boring for you to watch, for me to do the whole ring, but while I am, there's a few things that you should think about when you're working a Dorset button. You need to work it so that those stitches are as tight as possible, so every once in a while just go ahead and push them together. You're working initially with the ridge from the blanket stitch on the outer edge, primarily because it's easy to just keep working the blanket stitch. You can, if you want, sort of work it like that so they come to the back, but it seems that in the Dorset tradition they did not. They turned that ridge stitch to the back afterwards. So in order for you to not be bored, I'm going to put this on pause for a moment, finish off more or less covering this ring. Okay, so I've covered most of the ring, but there's still a little bit to cover, and I'm pushing that along, and I wanted to talk with you a little bit about some extra hints and tips. You'll notice that as I'm wrapping, I'm holding the thread off with 2 fingers. That is really helpful to stop the kinking, which you will get by continually pulling this thread through and covering the ring. The other thing that you can do if you do have a problem with your thread twisting up a lot is to dangle the button, hold onto the needle, and then dangle the button, and the button ring and whatever you've covered will actually spin at the end of the thread and help to undo some of that twist. So it is something that you really, you can get rid of, and you do want that twist out of it, the twist that starts to develop if you can. So I've started back to the beginning, and then if you take your needle and just push it through the first stitch or 2, that will help to ensure that the ridge stays sealed nicely. Okay, now you need to do what is called slicking in the Dorset tradition, and that is turning this ridge to the back. There are some buttons where the ridge has been pushed all the way through so that it's actually on the inside of the ring, but it's not very common historically. You don't see them as often as you do with them just with the ridge pushed to the back, but it's totally a preference thing, whatever you prefer. You see that ridge is now at the back of the button. And now for the stage that's called laying, and that is laying the spokes. So take your thread and come down the back. I'm putting my finger there so that you can see exactly what I'm doing. Come down the back at the center, okay? Come up, that's one spoke. Slightly rotate, anti-clockwise if you're right-handed, clockwise if you are left-handed, and repeat, going straight up the center of the mold. And you'll notice I'm calling the ring a mold, but that's simply because they're button molds. You're forming the button over it. Keep rotating and placing your spokes. For a crosswheel, you need a minimum of 6 spokes, really. Historically, they have an awful lot more. And if you are into working historically accurate crosswheel buttons, you should really use a very fine thread, white only, and do as many spokes as possible. So again, my finger's behind that to show you. You can see where at the back the threads are sort of not all in perfect alignment. So the next stage is to bring your needle up from the back and go back down. And so what you're doing now is you're tidying up those back spokes, lining them up, and you can put a few stitches here. And this is also the perfect opportunity to use your needle to push those spokes so that everything lines up as near to the center as you can get it on the button. And now you can start the filling stitches. So for the traditional Dorset Crosswheel, we work what's called a rounding back stitch. So we're going to come up in the middle of 2 spokes. We're going to go back, hence the back stitch, around one of them. So work back towards yourself, and then over to the next space. So you're coming up, around 1, under 2. So 1, 2. So I'm going to come up there. Back over 1, under 2, and come up. You repeat this all of the way around, filling the space from the center out to the rim. And what you're doing now is basically strengthening those spokes, the space between the spokes, but you're also joining the bottom and top spokes together. And so just keep working in a spiral to fill it up the button. And basically you're creating cloth at the center. And that's why these buttons were so good for garments that could be washed. So you didn't have to worry about the wooden mold getting wet, swelling, cracking, or anything like that. See, it's starting to fill up. Now I'm going to put this on pause again for a moment whilst I do this, because I'm sure you don't want to watch this repetitive part for another however many minutes. As you can see, I'm getting close to filling up the center section. How far you go really depends on the finished look that you want. I personally do like to fill up as far as I can to the edge. And that is another reason why occasionally you'll see the slicking part, which is moving that ridge, will go to the inside, as that will fill any excess space. But in all honesty, if you just sort of take your needle in at a little bit of an angle, you can get quite close and really fill up the section. Of course, you can choose to just work a little bit in the inside if you want to for a completely different button. So when you're happy that it's filled to where you want it to be filled, take your thread down to the center and fasten off. Now there are a lot of instructions out there that will say to you to sew your button on using this thread. Really, I wouldn't advise it. You're better to fasten that off, secure that thread properly, and then sew the button on using a different thread. Why? Because if that button is cut off of a garment and you've used the same thread that you've wrapped it with, the button's going to come apart.